The Senate will come to order. Before we move forward, we would like to take a moment to thank those of you in the gallery. It's been quite a while, several hours. You've done an incredible job honoring our wishes, and we appreciate that. We've got a long way to go, but we want to thank you for your conduct. Thank you. The following amendment, floor amendment number 1 by West. Secretary, please read the amendment.
Floor amendment number 1 by West.
Senator West to explain floor amendment number 1.
Mr. President and members, this amendment would bring the transfer requirements of abortion facilities in line with those of ambulatory surgical centers. Specifically, Title 25 of the Texas Administrative Code requires the ACS centers to have a written transfer agreement with a hospital or physician or staff to have admitting privileges at a local hospital. In keeping with the bill's intent to bring abortion clinics up to standards of ACSs, the amendment would apply the ACS transfer admitting privilege guidelines to abortion facilities. I move adoption.
Thanks, Senator West. Senator Hager on floor amendment number 1 by West.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator West. We've had a good discussion on this issue earlier today and during the committee hearing as well. I still think it's extremely important, though we may disagree, that the doctors have required to have admitting privileges and not just the transfer agreement. And with that, with all due respect, I'd ask we'd move to table this.
That's not what the amendment does.
Okay, go ahead.
It adds the transfer agreement to the requirements that you have in your bill. I think your bill is silent on whether or not a licensed abortion facility, once compliant with the ACS requirements, would have the ability to also enter into a transfer agreement.
I understand. And so with that, I still believe that this is not an amendment that I would like to accept.
So you don't want, even if this law is deemed to be constitutional and a licensed abortion facility must comply with the ACS requirements, you don't want that facility, licensed abortion facility, to have the right to enter into transfer agreements? Is that what you're saying?
I believe that this law will be held constitutional, and therefore I think that we should have the standard of what the bill presents, Senator.
No, but and obviously.
And I appreciate, but
okay,
that's,
what I'm saying is this: is that you have said consistently that you want these facilities, that is the licensed abortion facilities, to be on the same par, if you will, with an ambulatory surgical center. Ambulatory surgical centers have the right to have transfer agreements, and I just don't understand if indeed you want these abortion facilities to be on par, why you would not want these facilities to also have transfer agreements as an option.
they're going to move under this bill to ASC standards if they provide abortions, and those doctors would have admitting privileges and transfer ability today, as ASCs do, and I appreciate it, but I would respectfully request that we table this amendment.
Okay, so is there a statutory requirement that they have transfer agreements?
Senator, I'm asking for a vote, and with all due respect, I ask to table the amendment.
Yes, sir.
Senator West, you're recognized to close on the amendment.
Members, if indeed, the die has been cast, we know this bill is going to pass. If indeed the licensed abortion facilities are going to have to comply with the ASC requirements, then needless to say, they should be able to have the same privileges. And one of the privileges, and I think Senator Dillon and some of the other physicians would indicate, is that they have the ability to have transfer agreements. This particular bill is silent on that particular issue. And so I think that it's wise, even though I'm not going to vote for the legislation and final passage, that if indeed it's your intent to have them on par, then they should have the ability to have transfer agreement. Therefore, I ask you to vote against the motion to table.
Thank you, Senator West. Members, the motion on the floor is by Hager to table floor amendment number 1. Secretary, please call the roll. The motion is to table floor amendment number 1.
Birdwell, Campbell, Corona, Davis, Dool, Duncan, Ellis, Eltife, Estes, Frazier, Garcia, Hancock, Hager, Hinojosa, Huffman, Lucio, Nelson, Nichols, Patrick, Paxton, Rodriguez, Schwartner, Sulliger, Taylor, Uresti, Vandepute, Watson, West, Whitmire, Zaffarini.
19 ayes, 11 nays. The motion to table prevails. Thank you, Senator West.
Thank you for the use of the hall.
The following amendment, floor amendment number 2 by Uresti. Secretary, please read the amendment.
Floor amendment number 2 by Uresti.
Senator Uresti to explain floor amendment number 2.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, good evening. This amendment would allow for an exemption from the 20-week provision of the bill for pregnancies that are a result of rape or incest. It also makes clear, however, that the exemption does not include pregnancies that are more than 24 weeks old, regardless of rape or incest. This 24-week period is in keeping with the standard adopted by the United States Supreme Court, protecting as a constitutional right the ability of a woman to make reproductive health choices to end her pregnancy, so long as this does not occur after viability. Most OBGYNs understand fetal viability to occur at or around 24 weeks after the last menstrual period. Members, you may well know that similar 20-week bans in Idaho and Arizona were recently struck down as unconstitutional. However, and much more importantly, my amendment simply acknowledges the fact that rape is one of the most heinous crimes, some would even say a hate crime, that can be perpetrated against a woman. In fact, the FBI ranks rape as the second most violent crime, behind only murder. And members, don't kid yourselves into thinking that rape is a rare occurrence. According to the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault, 1 in every 5 Texas women have been sexually assaulted at some point in their lifetime. And every 2 minutes, someone in the United States becomes a victim of sexual assault. Over 80% of Texans who were sexually assaulted did not report it to law enforcement, and only 19% of sexual assaults are committed by complete strangers, meaning that over 80% of sexual assaults are committed by someone the victim knows, which helps explain the underreporting. Now, here's something I want to stress, so I hope all the members pay close attention. According to the Texas Department of Public Safety, in 2011, there were 19,011 victims of sexual assault, and the age group with the highest number of victims was 10 to 14 years old. 10 to 14 years old. That means quite simply that a vote against my amendment is not only a vote against rape victims, but largely a vote against child rape victims. Mr. President, Senator Hagar, my good friend, members, rapes perpetrated by someone the victim knows are the least likely to get reported, yet they account for a majority of the sexual assault occurrences in Texas. According to RAINN, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, victims of non-stranger rape experience a high degree of inner struggle and shame, and oftentimes they blame themselves for a crime that they didn't commit. Moreover, victims of non-stranger rape are more likely than other victims to be blamed and have their entire past sexual history scrutinized, and as a result, they feel re-victimized. Rape victims are 3 times more likely to suffer from depression, 6 times more likely to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, 13 times more likely to abuse alcohol, 26 times more likely to abuse drugs, and 4 times more likely to contemplate suicide. But when we put forth this very limited exception for rape and incest, the response that we get, but they had 5 months to decide. However, according to the Houston-based Children's Assessment Center, 73% of all child sexual abuse victims don't ever tell anyone about the abuse for at least a year. 45% of victims don't tell anyone for at least 5 years. And of course, some never disclose it at all. So if these child victims generally don't even disclose the abuse until 1 to 5 years after it has occurred, how can anyone reasonably say that 20 weeks is a sufficient amount of time for them to decide whether or not to end their pregnancy? Members, if a woman, possibly a child, has had to suffer the indignation of being sexually assaulted, I think the least, the absolute least that we as a legislative body can do is give that poor victim 4 more weeks, 1 measly month, to make the difficult decision as a victim of this heinous crime whether to have the abortion. Doesn't mean they will. It gives them 4 more weeks to decide. Given the inevitable physical and psychological trauma that rape victims endure, I don't think it is unreasonable to allow these women or children the necessary time to make one of the most difficult decisions of their life. I also want to emphasize that the United States House of Representatives, which as y'all well know is controlled by Republicans, recently passed a similar 20-week abortion ban that did allow for an exception regarding rape and incest. Now, though we may disagree on the best means by which to achieve this, members, we all want to see the number of abortions reduced. Now, we've also heard a lot about personal responsibility with respect to this bill, and how people shouldn't use abortion as birth control because they may have made a poor choice. Well, members, with regard to the victim of sexual assault, again, most of whom are children, who gets pregnant as a result of that assault, there's no discussion of personal responsibility. We're talking about a woman or a child, a victim in Texas, most likely a child being forced to submit to rape against her will and without her consent. Before I close, members, I want to share with you some numbers that I obtained from the Department of State Health Services. In 2011, 402 out of 72,470, or 0.57% of abortions were performed in Texas were at 20 weeks or later. In 2010, 420 out of 77,592, or 0.54%, of abortions performed in Texas were at 21 weeks or later. And in 2009, 457 out of 77,850, or 0.58% of abortions performed in Texas were 21 weeks or later. Given the fact that according to DSHS, just over 0.5% of abortions in Texas occur after 20 weeks, this amendment will not have a significant impact on the bill itself, but it will have a significant impact on those unfortunate victims of rape and incest. Recently, and Dean Whitmire alluded to this letter or email that we all received from an organization that stated, "We urge you to oppose all amendments to HB 2. We will consider all amendments to be hostile, and we will score votes supporting any amendments as anti-life votes." First of all, I can't ever recall getting an email that threatens us for voting for an amendment. But how can an amendment that deals with victims of rape and incest be considered anti-life? Ironically, this amendment I offered last session on the sonogram bill, which was very important, and it wasn't considered an anti-life amendment. And y'all voted for that bill, and I voted for that bill. So how can today my amendment, or any amendment, but my amendment specifically, be considered anti-life. Members, I ask you to please not vote against this language. Think with your head, vote with your heart. You know that this is the right thing to do. Have the courage to stand up for those victims and let them know that you care. Because if you do vote against this language, make no mistake about it, it will be a vote against victims of rape and incest. And on that vote, we will be scored by those victims. And with that, Mr. President, I move adoption of floor amendment number 2.
Mr. President, the gentleman yield.